right. So today's episode is on African sacred science. Now, this is one of those topics that tends to, for some people, raise eyebrows. For some, it triggers and raises certain emotions. And I think one of the reasons this happens is because this could be for some new information, and for others, it's just not conversations that are everyday conversations. People are used to the mainstream media conversation, the church, the Christian, the Buddhist. But when it comes to African sacred science, or some people say African spirituality, they're like, what is that? And then I guess the images go to the crazy media movies that depict people doing some weird stuff. So we are not going to be doing any of that today. Okay, we're going to be having a very serious conversation because from my research and what I have come to learn is African sacred science offers a complex and holistic approach to helping us understand the universe, the cosmos, well, let's just say the world per se and our place in it, right? And joining us to demystify African sacred science is the brilliant Verona Spence-Adofo, who is today's smart sister, and she will be doing a deep dive into this very complex topic. Welcome to Sisterhood Smarts. Verona, how are you?
I'm very good, Faith, and thank you so much for inviting me on the platform. I look forward to this conversation today, and hopefully that I can do this topic justice. As you said, it's one that has been misrepresented for so long. So I will do my utmost best to try and explain in most simplest terms and just, really give an insight into this topic, which unfortunately has been historically demonized and misrepresented intentionally as well. So I think it's important for us to kind of take away any preconceived notions and just have an open mind as we address the topic.
I love that. Yeah, I think that is so important because when you're ready to receive, then you really get the value in what is actually being taught. Now, I think we should start right from the beginning, because I know, Verona, you've been doing this for the longest time. You're like, what is the beginning?
Yeah, that's literally what I'm thinking. What beginning?
Okay, let me try it. Yeah, okay, we can start from. Okay, can you explain to us how African sacred science differs from Western traditional science, or should I say, what the word everybody uses right now, quantum science? So how it differs from quantum science or empirical science? Because everyone knows empirical science.
Yeah, I think what might be easier actually do is just to actually kind of maybe give a definition on what African sacred science is. And then from there, I think a lot more things will become clearer. So I think so how would I begin? So I was always grown up, and one of the things, once again, misrepresentations I was always told is that, across Africa, everyone believed in different things. Whatever different community group everyone was from, they had their own separate beliefs and blah, blah, blah. And you could argue there's different expressions that every community will have. But when we look at the core teachings, and this applies throughout the entire African continent, this is why we can say, when people talk about African spirituality, there's no such thing. I think it can represent the umbrella term to show there is a collective body of teachings that is expressed throughout these traditions. So we look at African sacred science, we're understanding there's core principles that exist amongst all of these traditions, beginning with the most obvious or the most, I guess, fundamental is this understanding of creation, this understanding of this totality, the supreme being, the all, God, whatever language you choose to refer to it as, is when we're talking about everything in creation, the sum total, that higher being, that supreme being, that life force. But when we look at the life force in the terms of African spiritual wisdom, that entity or energy is not separate from ourselves. That is expressed in all of creation. So what we see in the stars, the moon, the skies, the rivers, the oceans, they are all manifestations of the all. So when they tell you that, oh, Africans worship trees and rocks and things, it's not that they worship these individual things, but they recognize that everything in creation is part of the divine. So other spiritual faiths slash religions may have like this corpus of knowledge, sometimes contained in a book, that say this is how you learn about God. Whereas in African understanding is, because everything is in creation is this energy, by studying just one aspect of each of those manifestations of divine, allow us to get a greater understanding of the collective. So it's recognizing that this body of knowledge, this energy, this totality is so big, so vast. It's not something that can be contained in a building or within a book. But by understanding each of those elements, we gain a greater understanding of the total. Within these traditions as well, there's the understanding that of ancestors. Now, a lot of people also speak about ancestors. Oh, Africans worship their ancestors. Why would they do that? That's backward, primitive. But once again, when we're looking from the African spiritual perspective, nothing in creation is separate. Our ancestors are ultimately ourselves. We are the most recent incarnation of them. When we go and look at the concept of ancestors, we're talking about lineage. We're talking about that continuation of the bloodline that goes back to the very source of life. So when we look at ancestors, we're talking about that thread, that connection that embodies, that exists within us, that connects us to the divine. So even when we look at amongst the Zulus of Southern Africa, Unkulunkulu is the name for the supreme being. That name is also understood to represent grandparent, grandfather, grandmother. So it's representing that supreme elder. So when you look at it, how can the name for the creator also be the name that is used to describe your elders, your ancestors? So that's just by the language, through in the culture, it's embedded in the teachings that your very eldest ancestor is that supreme being. It's going back to that divine source. Therefore, we're not separated. So whilst I'm explaining African cosmologies, I'm trying to summarize as much as I can. Mm-hmm. But even when we look at the concept of, we've been taught to not reverence our ancestors. We've been taught that this is somehow a negative thing. But with the explanation I've just given, by intentionally trying to sever your connection to your own ancestors, is separating your self from the divine. It is the total aspect of your being, is your totality. In African spiritual thought, I'm not just sitting here as Verona, but I'm sitting here representing all the ancestors who have come before me. I've got my grandparents on my maternal side and my maternal side and so forth, going back and back and back in generations. All that knowledge, all those memory, all those wisdoms, that DNA exists within me, and it can be invoked and called upon at any time. So we all have access to this ancestral memory. And this is why we have things such as the ceremonies and rituals, which is another aspect, another core theme that is found across all of these traditions, is that we have ways to invocate, to invocate invocation rituals to call upon our ancestors, call upon our spiritual guardians and so forth, because these spiritual energies are not separate from us. In the same way, when I was speaking about elements in nature, we're not separate from that also. All those aspects in nature exist within ourselves. If we want to take it down to, if you go to this ocean and you have salt water in your tears. When we actually start to understand that we are a reflection, or we are an embodiment of everything that is reflected outside of us, we're the same. There is no disconnection. Western thought teaches us to see things as separate. Everything is individual. Whereas in African thought, everything is in union. It's a totality. So when we start to realize our relationship with our ancestors, our relationship with nature, the way we interact with those things becomes different. So I've just listed a few core themes that sum up what African spirituality is in a nutshell, in terms of themes that you will find, whether we're talking about the ancient Egyptians, whether we're talking about the H.H.N of Ghana, the Oromo of Ethiopia, or of the Zulus of Southern Africa, or the Bakongo of Central Africa. You're still going to find examples of these themes. And so, as I mentioned, whilst we have been taught that, we shouldn't be delving into these things, what we should also keep our minds aware of is the understanding that these teachings understand the duality that exists within creation, that everything that happens here in the physical also has a spiritual counterpart. So our relationship with life is about balancing that duality. Western thought has us stuck in the physical, waiting to return upon death to the spiritual. African spiritual thought has a secular relationship, understanding that everything is happening simultaneously. And so this understanding that we're here in the physical, our ancestors in the spiritual are still very much part of our lives. So learning to maintain that spiritual balance is how we find balance in our physical reality. Hopefully that helps.
All right. Wow. It got me thinking, because you said at some point, you said, when we delve into, but your description has told us that we already are. So this is quite interesting, Verona. I want you to touch a little bit on this. I think that Africans think that they have to delve into something, but you have just described you already are in it.
That is it. That's so true. We are already
in it, because you said we are. You're not sitting there by yourself. You're sitting there. And we know epigenetics, DNA. We know the science, the biology behind it. It's fact. You have your DNA of your ancestors. You look like them. You may look like great-great-grandmother. It's obvious at the basic level. But you said you're not there by yourself, right? So you're carrying this essence. And you also said that we are in everything, in the ocean, in nature, in the trees, in the earth. So if we're already in it, is there anything we need to get into?
I think that's true. I think the thing what we need to ultimately get into is knowledge of ourselves. And this is why I talk about this disconnection. And the disconnection is very much like a Western thinking of this separation. Whereas for me personally, once I started walking the journey of, revering my ancestors and wanting to learn more about the ways of those who came before me, something within me started to awaken. So it was like that ancestral memory started to rise up within me, whereas before I would say it was lying dormant. It was there, but because I wasn't actively focused or concentrating on it, I wasn't even able to perceive anything if it was even happening. So let me just give you an example. When I first started this journey, I was told that I should be actively calling upon my ancestors in my life. So I was like, wow, I didn't know this is something I'm supposed to be doing. So I was excited at the time because I was looking for something to feel a void within myself. I knew that there was something deeper that I hadn't connected to. And prior to that point, I was getting into spiritual teachings, but I still felt like something was missing. But once I started to implement ancestral reverence in my life, and when I started, it literally started as lighting a candle. And I invited my ancestors to let me know that they're around, to start guiding me, show me the way. And I also apologized to them for, not knowing that this is what I was supposed to do. And I can't remember the timeline, unfortunately, but maybe a few weeks or something, I don't know. But as soon as I started doing that, I started to experience synchronicities in my life. And for how it manifested for me was seeing the number 11 multiple times a day. I mean, like 8, 9 times a day. Every time I'd look at the clock, it was 11 minutes past the hour. So at that point, I had realized that intention, that ritual act of lighting the candle and of calling upon my ancestors created a physical response in my outer reality. So this is what I was saying about things are always happening, but it's only when we attune ourselves into ourselves that we can start to perceive this spiritual reality that has always existed. But because we're so focused on living in this 3D world, that we don't pay attention to these things. And then once I started to consciously acknowledge that, okay, this is you, this is how you guys are talking to me, then it started to manifest in other ways. Then I started to notice a lot of animal sightings and synchronicities. And especially when I started, I noticed a lot of particularly black animals like crows and ravens and bats and things like that. And interesting enough, they are also these animals that have been demonized. And we look at Hollywood and things like that, and they'll tell you it represents death and evil. But for
Those are
me,
really demonized, and they're always the bad luck birds in
yeah,
movies. And the owl as well. The owl.
yes. And so for me, I was like, these animals that have historically been labeled as negative were a sign of empowerment to me. And I knew straight away that that was a sign of like ancestral protection and guidance. And, you could argue that, yes, they do represent death, because you could, the fact that it's ancestors, it means that they've now transcended to the spiritual realm. So death in itself is not evil or bad, but it's also, when we look at Black in general, and Black animals tend to be associated with things like the occult, spirituality, the unknown, the unseen. So now within my wisdom, I can see that it's not something to be feared, but it was just me tapping into a different dimension of myself that had already existed, but I just wasn't privy to it.
Yeah. That is so interesting. And I think now it makes sense what you're saying when you sever yourself from it. So you are in it, you're born in it, it's who you are, but then you sever it by the things you embrace and the things you let go. I think now I get what you meant by that. You're it, but then you take all these different external things and those become your identity, who you are, where you spend all your energy and time, and you neglect who you actually are, is what I'm getting.
Yeah. And this is why children come into the world very highly spiritually perceptive. They know a lot of things, they see a lot of things, they experience it. But what do? We say, oh no, that's your imaginary friend, that's not real. And we start to stifle their natural creative expression. And so by the time they go to like schooling system and been indoctrinated by society, then half of these things are no longer as sharp as they were. And then we go through this process where we grow up and now we start to remember and tap in again. So it is a very interesting cycle.
Yeah, when you talked about children, I couldn't help but think about what could be the African sacred science of childbirth and the naming process, because I read some fascinating stuff about this. And then I look at how people are doing it now in Africa, and I'm like, oh my God. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about this.
Yes, I've actually found that to be one of the most fascinating subjects that we've come across in our research. And one of the things we have to realize as well, I've noticed within African cultures, is nothing is coincidental, number one, and nothing is just happens. Everything is very well thought out and has purpose and intention. So as a woman is pregnant, one of the things traditionally what would happen is a divination will be done on the mother during pregnancy to identify who that child is coming in. In the book by Sobonfu Some, I can't remember which title it was now.
I think intimacy something.
I think it was The Spirit of Intimacy where she said,
yes. The Spirit of Intimacy, yeah.
And she mentions what they call a hearing ritual, where an elder would be called to tap in and listen in basically through their gifts and be able to communicate with the child to find out who they are, so which ancestor is returning and what is the purpose of the child. I know amongst the Yoruba as well, they also have a divination process that is carried out in the very early days of a child being born. It's either during pregnancy when the child's being born, and then they find out once again, first of all, the name of the child, because that correlates with their destiny. So going back to your question about naming children. Naming is not a coincidental thing. Naming is not, oh, I like this name, so this is not what I'm going to name my child that. Naming has a very significant purpose, and a lot of communities will have multiple names to represent multiple things. So it can be, your name can identify the line that you fall in within your family. So whether you're the first child, second child, whether you are named after a particular ancestor, that may also come up. If you have been divined upon, your life purpose is also represented within your name as well. So your name is very powerful because not only is it like a signature marker of your identity, it also kind of gives you a blueprint for your own personal life as well. So if your name corresponds with your purpose, that is like a constant reminder that energy that you carry through your name is already following it through your life to achieve that particular purpose or goal. So yeah, namings are very significant because as everything in this world, it carries an energy. And so every time we call that name, we invoke that energy. That person is now being reminded of their purpose.
Yeah. So what has happened today to Africans? Because when you go to the continent, most people got their names from the Bible. You know, we have a lot of Bible names, Anna, you know, from the Bible, and not so many people have used the African names, or, and so, you know, they don't do the naming as it was done. So what happens to this child who was born in this culture and they didn't do that? What happens? So what is actually happening spiritually?
So this is a very good question. And I would say I can only really answer this from my own personal perspective rather than generally what happens. But what I would say is we already have everything within us as established at the beginning of this conversation. So we can never really be truly severed from something that we are already a part of. However, when we start to lose our names, when we start to get intentionally separated from our culture, when we intentionally become separated from our ancestors, it makes it a lot harder for us to tap back in. There has to be a very strong drive or something within you that, you know, keeps you clawing through to break beyond this physical paradigm and tap back in to that wisdom that lies within. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that these things that we have make it more challenging. So for myself, for example, I'm a child of the diaspora. I'm from Jamaica. I don't know where in the African continent I'm from. I was born and brought up with European names, first name and surname. So I don't know where I'm from. And as I said, well, for me, it was a case of I had to grow up realizing that, okay, the teachings that I'm being taught in the home don't resonate with me. But there was still a yearning. There was still this questioning, knowing that there was more to this physical reality. I grew up in a household where they would talk about obia back home, which is the name for spiritual practices carried over to Jamaica during the colonization period. And so obia is one of those things where it's often like used as a term of negativity when it actually refers to spiritual knowledge. If someone's an obia woman, it doesn't mean that she's bad, but it means that she has spiritual wisdom, spiritual knowledge, normally a herbalist. And yes, there are people who will use this knowledge for bad. I remember hearing my parents talk about this when I was younger, and I would be so fascinated and so intrigued by what they're talking about. But at the same time, I had consciously shut down all forms of spiritual thought here because I was like, I don't believe in this stuff. Like, this is not for me. But it was only until I went through, you know, puberty and my early 20s and I started learning about spirituality. And then it brought me back to those conversations where they were talking about obia in Jamaica. And I was like, I need to understand what these people were doing. Like, because I realized the way my parents would react with such fear, that there was a spiritual power there. There was something that made these grown folk scared. And there's something of importance. So there was a yearning in me. And the reason why I say all of this is to say that if that yearning is within you and you're questioning, then it doesn't matter what your name is. It doesn't matter about if you didn't grow up with XYZ. That calling will come to you if it's meant to happen. So going back to the original question, yes, names, all of those things are important. If you're naturally grown up in an environment where these things are already available to you, chances are you're just going to be more open and receptive to these teachings. And there's a lot of things that I had to learn later in life that I would have learned earlier. But I don't think anyone should look at that as a means to feel trapped, limited, or locked, because if you are called, that knowledge is going to come to you at some point anyway.
Yeah, and when it comes to, I was thinking about, because when you mentioned Jamaica and the connection to Africa, from what I've learned over the years is that everywhere you look, it's all a mix of everything. Everyone is kind of mixed up. So yeah, and you can look at people's features sometimes and guess where they're from.
I got that when I went to Ghana. They just kept telling me I look Ghanaian. I have cheekbones apparently, and I can see it. I can see it.
You do. You can guess sometimes. Like even we'll look at sometimes African Americans, and you're like, oh my God, he's a Luo. Like you just look at the feet and you're like, oh my goodness, this one is like West African.
Yeah.
So like you said, you are who you are. It's just it's in you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And back to the science, and I wanted us to talk a little bit about the famous Dogon, of Mali. Everybody talks about the Dogon and, how they had all this knowledge of astrology and astronomy. And, they were way advanced and they were looking at stuff with their naked eye. You know what I mean? Before telescopes and all the technology was available. And back in the day, they were called primitive because they were living in hats and, what people perceived as hats. Because now we know those are not just hats, right? So take it away. Just help us understand the application of African sacred science in cosmology and astronomy. And most people know about the Dogon and Congo as well. Maybe those are some
references. So what I would say to that is that it all ties back to what I said in the beginning, that everything in creation is interconnected. And this is what I found most empowering and so beautiful about these teachings is you start to really acknowledge the divinity that exists within yourself. And living in this kind of Western paradigm, it's made me realize how much we focus on like criticizing ourselves and beating ourselves up and always seeing the answer and solution outside of our own vessel, our own being. I have found in my own experience and from speaking to other African spiritual practitioners, it's literally through the practice of knowing yourself, and then we can even see the Egyptian quote of know thyself, that you will find that you are naturally able to start to understand the world around you. Why? Because the world around you is a reflection of yourself. So there's various different practices that have been done. So one of the main things that you'll find in our teachings is this concept of allowing ourselves to be one with nature, our natural environment. So things like being in a forest, going inside of a cave and meditating in those places in whatever way you choose to do so. There was a practice that I saw amongst the Igbos where it spoke about this act of this meditation where you hum like a bee. And it's like all of these different practices are ways to allow ourselves to tap into our internal consciousness. So even for myself, there's times when I'm given information, like if I'll ask, like, okay, what herb should I take for XYZ? And I'll be told, like, I will get clarity in my mind of exactly what herb I need to take and its purpose. I don't know this, like Verona doesn't know this. I'll go and check online and it will tell me word for word, that's what it does. And I'm like, wow. So when we ask ourselves, how were the Dogon able to know about, Sirius stars and all this stuff, is because they had an understanding of themselves and they understood that there was no separation between them and the whole of creation. And this is something that as African people, I feel that we really need to tap into, because it's no coincidence that we have been taught to view our history, our culture, our spirituality as something to be left in the past. Because the people who wanted to take us away from this knowledge know the power within it, and know that the world cannot be in the state that it is in today if we were to realign ourselves with this wisdom. And this wisdom, as I said, is literally about knowing ourselves. That's where it always starts. It's always about ourselves. So we can do this by studying ourselves. How do we react in certain situations? What are our mental processes like? What are our personal triggers? What things bring us joy? Simple things, like literally start to understand that. Start to say, which traits do I recognize within myself that I may have from my parents or even other ancestors in my line? Oh, I can see that there's bits of those. Because by understanding their story, you also start to understand yourself. By understanding your natural environment, you also start to understand yourself. And so the school of thought, the teaching, our university has always been our environment. And it's through allowing ourselves to be aware of our dynamic relationship with our environment is that we can start to attune ourselves to go back to that level of wisdom.
Wow, Verona. You've touched on something very interesting. You know how for the longest time, people said, oh, there are no schools in Africa, right? And, Africans, they bought it. They didn't understand what was going on. The whole environment was your school.
Yes. Yes.
Shoot, you just connected those dots. The whole environment was your school. So you didn't need the school. You also mentioned something that made me think about what now everybody's talking about, which is grounding. But again, back in the day, because you said Africans really need to know who you are and understand what the hell you're doing. Because now everybody's talking about grounding, walking barefooted in the earth.
Yep. And they'll tell you that some new age teachings, not realizing that's what your ancestors have been doing for years.
That's what they were mocked about. That's what they were told, that you look at those primitive people walking without shoes.
I know. And
now you know the health benefits of grounding. Please, when the things you're saying are actually very, very profound in helping people really know what is going wrong. The whole environment was your classroom. You didn't need, and now everybody's going back outside. The new trend is taking the children back to the earth.
Yes. So going back to that school conversation, because you made a very good point now, and I did kind of just gloss over it, not realizing how integral that is. When we understand that our whole environment is our school, everything changes. Yeah. So the way we even look at nature, for example, when you start observing nature and you pick up on the natural cycles, then you already become in alignment with how everything works. You don't need to go and have a whole classroom designed by that. You're actually watching things in real time. But then we even have to look at, what is an example of traditional African school? We've already established that your environment is nature, but one of the major forms of educations across African cultures is this concept of storytelling, oral storytelling, which can be accompanied by music, singing and dancing. And then we look at even learning today. We learn our ABCs and we learn it in song form. And that means that's something that we can just recall that at any time in our lives, we can sing that and we know and we can recite the alphabet. This is how historically we used to learn. And it's no coincidence, that when we did have storytelling gatherings, they normally took place outside in nature, by a tree or something, because you're tapping into that energy. You're also using the power of the word. Remember, as I said before, everything is energy. So by you even calling on these names of these ancestors, those who came before you, speaking about your traditional rituals and all of this, you're bringing it to life. You're bringing that ancestral memory through to the present day. So our version of education and learning was very dynamic in that sense, that it incorporated nature, it incorporated the natural elements, it incorporated our participation. And it wasn't just a physical participation, but a spiritual one also, because you're invoking those ancestral energies to be present within that storytelling experience. And what also happened in those situations where you bridge the gap between the elders and the youngers, and that's a very, very powerful dynamic that you will see in African cultures, is this idea of that duality is needed. The youngers are the next generation to carry on things forward. So it's important that they learn from those who are older in the community. And so that whole relationships kind of gives us the structure of how we carry out our education. And then on the back of that as well, you have what you would call these rites of passage programs, which would also happen for those who are kind of going into their teenage years, that kind of puberty stage. And once again, they will be taken by the elders and be taught kind of guidance for living to help them navigate and uphold the community and uphold these cultural values. So yeah, our concept of school is completely different. Nobody needed to tell us about connecting with nature and earthing and grounding, because that was something that we intuitively knew to do. We intuitively knew to go down to the ocean, for example, and that's where we'd go and do our prayers. That, you know, if we wanted to cleanse ourselves off, if we were feeling any negative energy, that's where we go. If we wanted to pray for blessings and abundance, prosperity, or whatever it is come in our lives, we would also go to the ocean or the river to do so. So we understood that everything in nature has its unique purpose and characteristics, and that we can invoke and utilize those energies at any time.
All right, this is so profound. And I'm just thinking about, why do you think that Africans did not value this knowledge? Why did they not value? Because now they consider the buildings the good schools, and they still ridicule the children who are learning under tree, and oh my God, those children who are suffering walking barefooted, when we know that those children are the healthiest. They have a very healthy, robust immune system. They're out running around in the sun. They're sitting in the fresh air. Now, when it rains and floods, that's a different story. So, don't bite my head off over here. I'm just giving you the gist of it all. But why do you think, and when we talk about Africa, these are 54 countries.
Yes. Yeah.
Why? That's a whole lot of people not valuing this. Why do you think they missed the mark?
I think the thing is that it's easy to say that kind of now, but the thing is, we didn't get here overnight. Like, this has been a systematic historical attack through colonization in its various forms. So, we can talk about chattel slavery. It's just one example, but we don't actually speak about what happened to Africans on the continent who weren't necessarily taken somewhere else. We can see that just from the legacy of what's continued, there has been a systematic attempt to disconnect us from anything that remotely connects us to our ancestral heritage, whether it's the demonization of our traditions, whether it's the killing off of our elders, our spiritual leaders. All of those things have been put in place. Then you have like the educational system that's been rolled out across the African continent, telling us that we need to follow this particular way of living, and how you were living before is not acceptable. Then there was even laws that have been put in place where if you're caught practicing, kind of ancestral teachings, you can be thrown in jail. There was incidences of like, you're not even allowed to play the drums are banned. So this is proper generational of saying, no, you can't do this. And it's been done in all forms, from religious teachings, from media program, from educational systems, have all systematically made us feel that there is something inherently wrong with connecting with these spiritual traditions. So it doesn't really say again.
Earth as well,
The earth, yes, the earth as well, and we can see it. That's very good. In terms of the earth, like, everything as
Because
Africans.
now, I remember, I'm a seasoned woman, and I remember back in the day when you couldn't just cut certain trees. It was forbidden. Those were sacred trees. You couldn't touch them. But now they just cut down everything and to build an apartment complex.
Exactly.
And
So our
yeah, it wasn't allowed. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that our spiritual teachings are nature centered spiritual faiths. And for me, you can see the correlation of when there was the demonization of women, and women's roles and the female energy when it comes to spirituality is when simultaneously we notice the denigration of nature as well. So, what we're living in is a result of this kind of patriarchal impact and the ways that it manifests itself. And that does include diminishing nature, diminishing women, and this kind of value for what was there before. And so, it is quite dangerous because we've seen that the impact is so far reaching that a lot of African people today will look at these teachings and say, I don't want to have nothing to do with it. Oh, this is witchcraft. This should be left in the past. And it just goes to show how out of alignment we are with our own selves when you wouldn't even want to learn about your own self. Like, if we want to talk about the impact of colonialism, I would say that when we look at the mental legacy of all the different things that have taken place, that is something that's so paramount that we don't realize how impactful that is. When you can actively say you don't want to learn about your own lineage, your own heritage, your own spirituality, that is already, as far as I'm concerned, a sign of like a spiritual inferiority complex. And that's something that we've inherited across the globe. It exists in the diaspora on the continent. And it's only through when we start really asking ourselves these uncomfortable questions and really tapping into it, then we can start to address it and heal from those wounds.
Yeah, that is quite, like you said, it's quite dangerous because it influences, how you run your homes, how you raise your children, what you prioritize, how you do your business, how you run your communities. This is really dangerous. The things you're saying today are really, really eye-opening because when you think about even innovation and technology, you mentioned dance. A lot of the African dances were inspired by nature. They were inspired by animals. People see you doing this, and it's the trunk of an elephant, or the birds, or they were inspired. And in everything that we were doing, it was in alignment. And I think the farther, you said the word server, the farther you move, you can actually see the impact. It's gradual, but you can see it as you move farther and farther and farther and farther away, because now you're just dancing to, the music today. It's not, we know about the frequencies and what is in the music. And that is what you're feeding your soul and your spirit.
Yeah.
Back in the day, you were actually singing. Families were singing. You were singing songs of love and joy, and that's what you were feeding your soul.
Yeah. 100%.
There's a lot of things that you're saying, really, that are so important. And the father and father, that's why there's the separation of family community, because the soul is not being fed. There's no nutrition. People say soul food, but what food are you taking in?
Yeah, and I think this is what's really been fascinating. We started Ancestral Voices 14 years ago now, and we can see that when we first started it, there was some people interested, but it was still very much quite like, wow, this is like a really different topic to be exploring. But now it's amazing to see how much more commonplace this conversation is. And for me, that is very heartwarming because it shows that many of us are listening to that inner calling. A lot of us live and navigate through this world knowing that something's not right, but we can't necessarily put our finger on it. But there's been this yearning, this calling us back to kind of tap into this ancestral knowledge. The fact that we disrespect nature, the fact that we pollute her soils, pollute her waters and put chemicals in her air. Why would we do that to the very essence that keeps us alive? that already shows the dysfunction that exists within our society. And that shows the dysfunction that lives within ourselves. Because if we understand that we are interconnected with nature and there's no separation, there's no way we would be poisoning our own waters. It makes no sense. So this is a physical representation of the spiritual imbalance that is going on within us. But the more people that start to reconnect and tap into this knowledge, we can actually start to see, a better environment playing out for us in our physical reality.
Yeah, let's go back to something which I don't know whether we'd say this is off topic. You'll decide whether it's off topic or not. But I was just thinking of, how people say, the origins of man, right? Started in Africa, and they like to say the Black woman is the mother of all. Do you believe in this concept? Do you believe that the African woman, the Black woman, and I like, because what is an African woman? Even the name African, we don't want to go into that word because it's not a word you really want to identify yourself with. But hey, for lack of better words, we are using it. So do you believe that the Black woman is the mother of all?
I would say when we go back to the creation stories, you always find that, number one, when we're talking about creation, there's this aspect of duality. So let's just take it back there. So if we look at modern religions today, they're very much on male God, male energy. That is the focus. When we look at African spiritual thought, there is this duality. There is understanding that both masculine and feminine are necessary to create life. But then even when we look into those teachings even further, we do find that this feminine form keeps appearing, and the feminine is associated with water as well. So even when we look at water, where can we look at why water would be symbolic and relevant? Well, when we come into this physical incarnation here, we come through what? Our mother's womb, which is the portal to the spiritual realm, which is surrounded by water. So when we talk about the Black woman is God, we are referring to these cosmological concepts that exist within these teachings as physical representations of that creative process, that process of going from the unseen into creation, that process of bringing life into being, which is exemplified by the woman. So that's what that is, and that represents that. So for me, when we talk about the Black woman and we're talking about, going back to some of the older creation stories, then we're definitely talking about a highly melanated woman that would be at the center of these stories.
The reason why I asked that is if she is the mother, then she has birthed, and if she's the mother of all and she created all and she birthed all, what is it we're really looking at now? Because these are all her children. That's why I asked whether this concept, is she the mother of all? Because that means she has brought forth all life, all the colors, all the race.
I see where you're going.
Those who have put her and her children, the melanated ones in the, what I mean, who has, created the situation we see on the continent in Jamaica, amongst the melanated, highly melanin-dominant races.
That's a very good question. That's the thing, because in a lot of the creation stories as well, you always find this idea of entities coming from another place as well. So like so I'm just thinking of like the Dogon, for example, and they have what are known as the Nomo, which represent these kind of these amphibious creatures that came from another dimension, another like realm, and they came here and implanted their wisdom. So in terms of this whole breeding of all life, that I guess could go into a whole can of worms of questions about whether are these human entities and all of that, because that's a whole big conversation. And that one I'm not as clued on as that one. That one is a bit of a difficult one for me to answer. But what I will say, though, is in the same way we notice the demonization of the divine feminine. We've noticed the demonization of nature. We've noticed the demonization of African indigenous spiritual teachings and anything that kind of connects us to this kind of ancestral wisdom. Another thing we can look at in society is the demonization of the Black female. And that's something that's very prominent and very intentional also. So for me, these are all signs to show that when we flip things over, there's been an intentional suppression because there is a power there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what was once revered is now being pushed the opposite direction.
Yeah, and I think, at the core of our conversation, you've really tried to reiterate the power of going within and knowledge of self. And I think this is important for everybody listening to get it, because whatever race you are, you have to go within and have knowledge of self. Because when you focus on learning and mastering who you are, then you don't have the time to focus on diminishing someone else, because you are now confident in self and in who you are. And that is something very powerful, because I think, like you said, when we're talking about how African sacred science differs from empirical science or Western traditional science, you mentioned that the African science is more internal, go within, and the Western traditional science is external. Look outside of yourself to find answers, look outside of yourself to find solutions. And I think there's power in that, and I think everybody can take a leaf from that, because going outside is not working. I don't care where you're situated, whether you're in Europe or in Africa or Asia or the Americas, please, it's not working. So that's actually a good tip Verona has given us there, because we have to try something different. And I think this is a very, very good conversation, Verona, because also when you mentioned how when you go within, but we were talking specifically at Africa, when I asked you about the Dogon and astronomy and astrology, you said that they had gone within, they had such a strong knowledge of self that they were able to see everything with their bare eyes. And I want you to talk a little bit about this, because right now we are going towards the direction of technology. Everything is becoming even more technologically advanced. And you are talking about, for lack of better words, we are the technology.
Yeah.
Right? So can you talk a little bit about this? Because that was a bombshell you dropped there, because you said, go within and you will do everything. You can see everything. You are, basically, you said everything, the knowledge.
That's a good question. I would say that everything we have in our physical reality now, technology-wise, already exists within ourselves. So if we look at the internet, for example, as far as I'm concerned, the internet is the physical incarnation of what our minds are capable of. And I gave the example before about being shown different herbs and the way that they can be utilized. So if we start to understand that we are the technology, and the technology has always been around us, that we are an extension of nature, we're an extension of our ancestors, then everything in creation has the ability to allow us to connect to what we need to know. So one of the things that I've been learning more about increasingly is the use of plant medicines amongst traditional African communities as a way to tap into different realms. So we're wondering, how are they able to do this? But this whole concept of like journeying, whether through plants or whether just in our natural state, is how we are able to transcend this physical reality and go into different states of being and this different levels of consciousness to enable us to access different information. So different ways, for example. So one of the ways is through things like ceremonial dance. Let me give an example. Amongst the Khoisan people of Southern Africa, they would do a dance around a fire. And through that act of doing this dance, they were able to kind of go into a trance state and receive information from ancestors about, different healing, things that they can do to benefit the community. Amongst the I can't remember their name. They're based in Gabon. I can't remember now, but they used to take the Bwiti of a is it the Bwiti? Yeah, Bwiti ceremony amongst the Gabon, and they take iboga, and iboga is like a hallucinogen, which in those states you can start to receive spiritual guidance and knowledge of how to navigate and do certain things, and you'll get certain clarity. So we have always understood that what we need is in nature, whether it's for healing purposes, whether it's for spiritual wisdom and growth, all of that stuff exists there. So once we start to understand what in nature is beneficial to us or the impact that it will have on us, these are all ways that can help us to connect within to these different states. So it doesn't have to be plant medicines. That's just one example. As I said, dance is another. There's different methods that have been used by different communities to kind of access these higher planes of wisdom.
Yeah. And when you say accessing these higher planes of wisdom, what I have learned from different African cultures is it was more like, and I wouldn't say tribes because I was taught not to call them tribes. I was taught that they're nations and not tribes. So, different nations within a specific country is that people had different roles. So, not everybody was a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
not everybody was supposed to be a carpenter or an electrician, or a seer, or tuning in and getting the ideas and technology innovation. For somebody who's listening and doesn't know much about how African sacred science works, can you help us all understand why this was important to identify certain people for certain roles and why everybody did not have the same role per se, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense? And how did they do it?
Yeah. So this is the thing, because everybody in the community has their own unique purpose. Everybody who even lives, this is another thing we've come across in our research, that this idea of like a purpose, that we're all born with our own unique characteristics that are beneficial to our community. Now, these are the things that are identified during the sort of initial days of birth or during childbirth through the process of divination or a ritual that will be carried out to identify who that person is and how they are going to serve their community. What is it that they bring to their community? And so people might say, oh, but how do I do that? Like in this day and age, how do we navigate that? So as we've identified things like, if traditionally your name would be somewhere that you would look to identify what it is. But even now, if you're like, I have no access to that, I don't have a traditional name, how would I even know who I am and what role I'm supposed to play? And, how do I navigate with this? One of the things I would say is literally look at your life, your experiences, the things that you've gone through. And a lot of us kind of go through certain hardships in our life and think, oh no, this has happened to me and it's so bad. And, we can end up getting caught out with things like feelings of guilt and shame and all of this stuff, but not realizing that what we have internalized as this really, really bad thing. We can also look at those experiences and think, what have we learned from those experiences? And what from those experiences can we pass on to others that we've now learned from experiencing it that can be utilized to help other people. So our experiences often are key indicators to why we are here, the purpose that we come to bring. It might be that you've gone through a particular situation and you've learned to overcome it within yourself. And now because you've overcome it and you speak to other people about it, they're like, oh, wow, that is really enlightening. That's helped me so much. Da, 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 da. It could also be, as you mentioned, the example of a teacher. There might be certain teachings that you have come across that you share with others that is of benefit. You could be a natural medicine person. You might be someone who's a good herbalist. Everybody will have their own different roles. But the thing is about finding out about yourself. Once again, is that know thyself thing, but really seeing where you excel. because often we don't necessarily realize our own traits, what we're good at. It's normally other people who say, oh, wow, you're really good at doing X, Y, Z. And you're like, really? I didn't know. But it's recognizing what that is. And it's normally something that you love and you will do with, effortlessly. You'll just do it because it's your passion. That is where you're really starting to tap into your purpose, because it's something that you do without even getting paid, because you love it and it makes you feel good. And that is something that I would recommend to anyone, if you start to tap into that part of yourself and allow that to flourish.
Yeah, when you were talking about, the way it's done, and people, it will be done at birth or pre-birth, and then they would find out who you are and what your purpose is and stuff like that. I could help thinking about what the structures we have created now. So people are born and their parents already, like, they have forecasted the 10 key careers that will be
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
will be, kick-ass in the next, 10, 15 years. And then they put their children in there and be like, honey, you're going to do this and you're going to excel. And then on the flip side of it, we're also seeing a spike of mental health issues, where people are saying they have jobs, they have lives, some don't, whatever the situation is, there's a spike in mental health problems. And I want you to, I don't know whether you've read, I think you've read the book by Malidoma Some,
Of
about
water and the spirit. Which one?
the one where he talks about mental health, but from an African spiritual perspective.
Um,
He says
I
that
don't-
it has something to do with your calling.
yes, yes.
And schizophrenia, I mean, this is not medical advice. We have to tell you that right now up front, please. Okay, we're just having a conversation to share some information that you should research further. But I'd like you to talk about how this practice, this African sacred science practice of finding out who is coming through and identifying what their calling is, or also right now, if you can identify yourself by the things you're interested in, like you explained, tell us whether you can see any correlation with the spike of mental health, schizophrenia,
Definitely.
bipolar, PT, all these things.
Definitely. So, first of all, I would say, I think in general, a lot of us right now are experiencing these kind of mental health conditions because the way that we live is not natural. And I think we've always known it's not natural, but everything now is kind of coming to the surface and it's like we can't deal with it anymore. It's like it's boiling point. We're not supposed to be living in this way. So when we look on African spiritual perspective of mental health issues, whether it's things like schizophrenia or neurodivergent conditions such as ADHD and autism, from an African spiritual perspective, these are often signs of being spiritually gifted. So they are signs where you have a particular calling in life, and some of these traits that in Western society would look at and say, something's not right, you need to be on meds or you need to be locked up. Traditionally, they would actually see it as though, oh, okay, we can see that you have that ability to dance between both worlds, and that there's certain information that may be trying to come through to you that you're not in a position to fully understand. And so they will be of assistance to help you through that. So the sort of elders in the community, the what we would call the shamans or the okonfos, they would be the ones, the sangomas, they would be the ones to kind of help navigate that situation with you. Another idea as well that comes up in the spiritual teachings is that when you don't align yourself with your life purpose, that can also cause mental health issues. And that may come in various different forms. But in terms of the ones who are, as I mentioned, the kind of shamans of the community, they're the ones where it's very well known for people to have mental breakdowns and things like that, that it is normally representative of their calling. And it's so interesting because I've always known this. I've known this from the very beginning of our research. But it was only until, so this was 2011 now, when I gave birth to my first child. I went through my own kind of, I wouldn't even say mental health issue, because I didn't correlate it at the time as a mental health issue. But I, on the back of giving birth for the first time, so it never happened with my second son, but I went through a period which went on for a very long time where my memory was just, I wouldn't say it disappeared, but I went through a very strong period where my mental ability to retain information was really, really impacted. And I never really realized how intense this was until we started doing the research for our second documentary, Spirit is Eternal. And this was around 2013. And so I gave birth 2 years before, and I was thinking, no, this can't be baby brain. This is going on for too long. And I remember like going through books to read books for the research for the second documentary. And my husband would ask me afterwards, what did the book say? And I'll be like, I don't remember. Like, I just could not remember any information. And so I went into a spiral after that for years, feeling very insecure about not being able to recall information. I felt like I shouldn't be doing this work because I felt like I was an imposter because I can't remember anything. And what also happened simultaneously around that time is I started to become really spiritually sensitive. Like, I was very emotional. I felt emotionally naked is the only way I can describe it. It felt like anyone could say anything to me and I would be so like hurt and wounded by it. And I became very anxious, like my anxiety levels were higher. I was just very emotional all the time. And so I was just thinking that, I'm a nervous wreck. I don't know what's going on with me. And then jumping forward now to 2017, during a ritual meditation, clarity came when I was told that the reason why my memory had gone is so that when I speak, I'm not supposed to speak from my academic learning and research, but I'm supposed to speak from my intuition. And I was like, wow. And when I came into that insight, it was like such a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It was like suddenly everything made sense. And so it was only until literally a couple of years ago now, or maybe last year even, that, doing some more research, I came into this concept of what is known as being called by the water spirits. Now, I already knew from the very beginning of my kind of ancestral journey that the Orisha, because I've got my reading to find out which is my Orisha, the ruling head. So just to confirm, Orishas are natural forces, nature forces amongst the Yoruba tradition. We'll find these natural forces across different names. So they would be the Loa in Haitian Vodou, the Neter across Egypt, for example. So Yemaja is represented by the water, represented specifically by the ocean, actually. And so she is this element who represents this like maternal figure, this kind of divine healer archetype. And then when I started to look into this whole concept of being called by the water spirits, one of the things that came up was they can manifest in your life as kind of mental health issues, and like it can cause kind of like dysfunction in your life. You may notice like an unexplainable stagnation. It could manifest as financial problems and all these different things. And when I did the research on that, and then I was like, wow, this is what happened to me. And then only when I started to learn even more, I found out that what I experienced post pregnancy was also the same kind of symptoms of how ADHD manifests itself in adult women. So it's like all of these correlations came in at once, and I was like, wow. And another thing that I realized is because I spent all that time, like a period of 7 years or whatever it was, focused on what I was not good at. I never paid attention to what I did excel in. So on the back of that experience of childbirth, which I've come to realize many people do get triggered by childbirth, and it does open up this kind of different spiritual aspect to themselves, is I became very highly intuitive. My ability to decode dreams and symbolism, all of that stuff increased. I mean, before a little I had it, but post-pregnancy, it was like a different person. So I was able to identify myself from my own experience, despite doing all this research for years, not really realizing I actually lived through the process and was lucky enough to make it outside the other end to tell the tale.
I know.
But
Because I'm
literally,
curious what your doctors would have
yeah,
said about all of this.
yeah.
Yeah.
So literally, this energy that is represented by this primordial waters, this mother who is symbolically shown often as being pregnant. Her name literally means mother of the fishes. This water,
Mother of the fishes?
mother of the fishes, yeah. This water energy is what manifested through me, and it invoked this change within my life. And then once again, being of Jamaican heritage, anyone's listening, they'll be aware as well that in Jamaica, if you dream about fish, it means that someone's going to have a baby. So, all the symbolism is there, the correlations there. It's amazing. But yes, through the act of childbirth, there was something activated within me that kind of catapulted me into this whole reality. So yes, mental health experiences, also aligning with acts of trauma as well, can also be kind of gateways into these spiritual experiences.
Verona, you've said some really serious stuff because it's got me thinking about the psychiatry. Let me just call it what it is. You know, I'm sorry to open this box, but I think, we can touch on it a little bit because what you have said, and like you said, you came out on the other side, but that's through your knowledge. You have this knowledge and this background. How many people don't?
Yeah,
And end up, that could have gone so many ways. As you were talking, I was like, oh my God, that could have gone so many ways. Do you think that, or what do you think African sacred science or African spirituality? What do you think? What's the role? Do you think they play a role in psychiatry, or do you
oh,
think their knowledge could be beneficial and useful in the field of psychiatry, and it should be used a little bit more? Because I
definitely.
couldn't get over that. Yeah.
Definitely. So before I answer that question, just for your listeners as well, I need to add more context to that, what I just explained. Those people who may be listening and have gone through a similar experience, or what I've said resonates with them in some shape or form. One of the things that is recommended if this is happening to you is that people who've experienced it often will either need to have some kind of, well, first of all, see like a spiritual practitioner, and they are normally advised to maybe have some kind of shrine or something dedicated to this particular water energy to balance that relationship. Or in some cases, people may need to go the full distance of being initiated. So I just need to put that out there just for additional context of how to balance this energy. In my case,
Are people gonna do all that?
no, not necessarily, but I feel like I need to put my disclaimers out just to finish the storyline. So,
Some are just like, oops, I'm gonna just go take a pill.
but yes, I'm just giving that alternative message.
Make my life
Also,
easy, take the pill.
in my case, I actually did already have a shrine in honor of Yemashab from the actual spiritual path that I was following. So that was always there in place for me. But I would say also as well, as I mentioned, we are already nature. We are already connected to our environment. So if you are resonating with what I said, really start developing your relationship with water. Whenever you go into the shower or the bath, you can use that as an opportunity to pray, connect to this energy, take regular visits to the ocean or river, wherever you may be called to go. And these are ways that you can start to try and align your energies for yourself. If that doesn't help, then yes, you can go see someone. So I had to put that disclaimer in there. Otherwise, people will be like, what do I do? You told me that, but what do you do? Now, going back to...
Yeah, you've given them a cheat sheet, which is kind
Yeah, but I also do consultations as well. So if anyone does want to talk to me, I am available to do that. But yeah,
I
psychology.
just know what people, Verona. I just know.
Yeah, I know. People is like, I actually always tell people, I feel like the initiation journey is something that if you're called, you're called. But I personally really want to empower people through empowering themselves. And this is why I always give you solutions that you can do yourself. That's why I'm like, go connect with water, because nothing is stopping you from doing that. It's free, it's abundant. Allow yourself to tap into that. So that's that. In terms
Our
of
body is 70% water.
exactly our very self. So it's literally about, once again, it's all with yourself. So you start building that relationship with water. That's already the majority of your body makeup anyway. Then you're balancing and regulating yourself.
Yeah.
So psychology. Now, psychology
Thank you.
is so important.
Yeah.
And as we're going back to what you were saying about Malidoma and identifying that, what we call people with schizophrenia and mental health issues, um, they are actually gifted, but it hasn't been nurtured and cultivated within themselves. Now, I just gave an example using my own self about people who have gone through mental health challenges and come out the other side. Those people who kind of go through this, and I would call it's a life initiation, they are the ones in the community historically, the ones we want to call the Okomfos, the Ugans, the different names that you'll give to those kind of spiritual healers within the community. They are the psychologists, they are the doctors, they are the herbalists, they are the diviners. They, it's all interchangeable. Some people might just have one role, but often you'll find that psychology is very much tied in there. So people who have kind of gone through this type of initiation of seeing themselves out the other side of being unwell and facing certain challenges are normally the ones in the community to be able to help others in similar situations. So there is no separation between what we would call a traditional doctor or whatever you want to call them, and a psychologist, because they understand that everything is interconnected. They also understand that these problems transcend just the physical realm. So they're not going to look at the problem and just focus on, okay, this person is acting like this and doing X, Y, Z. They're going to look at the situation holistically and think, okay, what could be potentially out of alignment? What could be out of balance? What could they be spiritually picking up on? Do they need a spiritual cleansing bath to maybe cleanse their aura and clean them from anything else that they may be picking up on? Do they need to go and bathe in the river or the ocean to cleanse them? Do they need a particular blend of herbs that are going to now balance out the energies that are within them? Is it a case of there's some emotional blocks that they need to clear, that they need to release? So there's all of these different things that will be taken into consideration to try and help a person. It could also be, in some cases, there could be something ancestral going on, and that also needs to be addressed. That's causing a physical manifestation for the person. So that may be manifesting as something negative or uncomfortable in someone's life, and that may require something being cleansed from something that's happened in the past. So there's many different things, but those people who deal with this are people who have gone through a journey of training over several years. And that is about studying with the elders, studying through nature, and also through studying themselves, that they are able to help with these situations.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but smile over there when you were naming the people who would help with the healing, the Sangoma, the Ugans. These are all going to be called witchcraft.
This is what's really...
Verona is straight up telling people to go, in Kenya. Like in Kenya, they'll be like Muganga, You're telling people to go see a witchcraft and bathe in herbs.
But this is the thing. This is what is so fascinating, because
I'm laughing, but
I know why you're laughing.
They will just go crazy hearing this. They're going to lose it. But then, guys, please just to push the rewind button, because y'all go to the spa.
Well, this is it.
Go to the spa, and they put herbs in your water, and you come out feeling refreshed and regenerated.
Exactly.
So that's what Verona is telling you, to go to a spa.
You'll go to a spa, and they'll be like eucalypt oil and everything, and you're like, oh, this is so wonderful, relaxing. that's just like a herbal bath thing we were doing before, like these are things. And this is what's amazing. This is what I found so fascinating, is that I have to say that I actually came up this kind of spiritual knowledge through learning about New Age teachings and realizing that I like the teachings, but it feels very whitewashed. I was like, but where are these teachings from? And it was only when I started to go back and learn and really tap into this African knowledge that I was like, wow, all this stuff that they're teaching you in this day and age, that they've repackaged, rebranded, is your own stuff. So yeah, like we shouldn't be afraid of who we are. We shouldn't be afraid of our knowledge, and we shouldn't be able to only accept it once it's been repackaged and represented to us at a high price.
You know what, Verona, I think would help our people if we changed the words. We just created a new language for these things. I think just remove, because those words, those like the Sangoma, the Muganga, the witch, whatever, remove those words and guys get new names,
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's funny.
Because we can't outgrow those words. And those words, by the way, when you look at the etymology, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not negative. They're not negative words. It's just like a pagan, I think witch means the wise ones. They don't mean what you think they mean. But I know we're over it. We're not gonna, they'll hear this, they'll be like, no, but they'll go to the spa and bathe in a whole lot of herbs.
I mean, that's the thing. A lot of words over time have, picked up negative connotations when in their original form that's not it. And that's the thing, as you mentioned, witch being a prime example, even though it's not necessarily an African word, but we tend to kind of look at these words as negative. But a witch just refers to a woman who was very knowledgeable about her abilities, her gifts, her relationship with nature. She'd be the one who'd be able to know what herbs to take to help with someone. And once again, I have to emphasize this point of the things that have been demonized are the very same things that were once revered and that can empower us. And so, it's about kind of allowing ourselves to awaken to that aspect. And for those who feel like historically they may have been condemned, like myself, telling my story of this and all this and my spiritual abilities, once upon a time be demonized, but it's about really embracing it and saying, this is a part of who I am. I do get dreams and I am able to decode them, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I help people decode dreams, and I love doing that as well. And it's like being able to kind of find what you naturally do and be unapologetically do it. That's another way we also help our ancestors, by being able to live freely in a way that they couldn't, because a lot of this stuff had to be suppressed and go underground to keep it alive. And so now that we've been able to kind of retain this knowledge and tap back into it, we do them justice by able to kind of live and walk in our purpose and heads held high with it too.
Yeah, no, I love it. But, I just had to bring that up because, I know it without a shadow of a doubt. But I really love that you said this, and, over and over again. I mean, we have to really look at what you're already doing this stuff. You're just doing it in a different context. You just refuse to attach it to what you define as Africanness, or, you're ashamed of that aspect of it. But you're bathing in the herbs, you go swimming in the ocean and you feel great after that. Why do you feel great after you do certain things? You know what I mean? So we're just going to leave it there. Now, Verona, I want to be respectful of your time. So we'll just take one more question.
Sure.
And I think we can wrap it up with, how do you think that African sacred science can influence the modern world? And how do you think, and how can it be applied in our day-to-day? Because I loved the cheat sheet that you shared.
As you said as well, it's like, because it's not explicitly labeled as African sacred science, people don't necessarily realize what it is. Every single thing we do in our lives is a ritual. We get up, we brush our teeth, we do all these things. These are all rituals. As we know already, this whole concept of ritual and doing things with intention and purpose are very much part of African cultures. So, instead of serving a system that has us kind of getting up every day, working 9 to 5, doing this, doing that, doing all these other things which we naturally do on autopilot, I would say to people, why not start to try and implement rituals in your daily life that benefit you, that nourish you, that spiritually elevate you? Because once we start kind of getting into that practice, because this is the beauty of African spiritual traditions. It's not like just a philosophy that you understand. It's something that we have to eat, sleep, live, and breathe, because it's through our experience that we can kind of tap into this. So a lot of people always say, oh, but how do you know your ancestors are around? Like, once you start to experience it for yourself, there's nothing to prove. It's like, you can do this too. There's nothing stopping you. So it's about having that intention to bring what we want to bring into our lives for whatever rituals may serve us. So you may want to have a candle that you light in the morning, or pour libation in their honor, the act of pouring water to the earth or to soil, and just literally setting your prayers, your intention for today, invoking that essence within yourself. It may even be something simple as, when you wake up in the morning, you just have your intention of what you're trying to do, and allow that energy to flow through you throughout the day. And you close the day and also do something similar before bed. Thank you. Thank you for your guidance. Thank you for your teachings. Thank you for allowing me to get through today and have a great conversation. Whatever it is, these are things that we can start doing. I would definitely say, for me, my top 2 tips outside of ancestor reverence, which I've found really beneficial, is just that connection with nature. Our physical world is so demanding, so energetically draining as well. And so the more you can connect with nature, it's like the more you start aligning yourself. It's a way to reconnect, rebalance your energies, and also nourish yourself. So whether that's something as simple as sitting under a tree in a park, which is one of my favorite pastimes, I find that it completely changes my whole energy. Whether it's going to a body of water, if you have that ability to be close to a body of water, whatever it is for you that allows you to feel connected, I would say embrace that. The thing about our spiritual teachings that I've also found really empowering is the fact that I never feel alone. Like, I was someone who used to always have to be around people. I had to always be out doing stuff. Otherwise, I felt like life was passing me by. Whereas now there is such a feeling of peace and contentment knowing that I am surrounded and that they're around me. And that is a very empowering place to come from. Whereas before, I felt lonely and isolated quite a lot. And that's not something I experience anymore. I also would say that incorporating African sacred science in your life provides a bit of grounding and balance, no matter how challenging our physical reality can get. Because let's be clear as well, this spiritual knowledge is not going to stop you from having problems. What it does do is it gives you tools that you can implement that help you to navigate those challenges that life will naturally throw up to you. So it's not a magic wand. It is a way for you to become better within yourself. And to summarize, the teaching of African spiritual concepts, particularly in the name of ancestors, is about becoming the best version of yourself, being able to be an exemplary example for those around you and those who come after you. That is the true definition of becoming an ancestor, somebody worthy of reverence once you're no longer here. And so I feel that that kind of working towards self-betterment, not just for the individual, but for the collective, that is an energy, an attitude that is reflected in our teachings. And if we were to embody that today, we would truly see that reflected in our wider society.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't you just love the sun on my face?
Beautiful.
Getting those cosmic rays.
You are. That's so beautiful. The divine light is shining on you. Beautiful.
But I know I said that was the last question, but I have a little small follow-up question. It can't leave my mind. When you talk about communicating with the ancestors, I was wondering, is it because our ancestors go way back? We don't know them all. At least I know I don't know all mine. If I'm going thousands of years back, right? They go really far. Can you call on the wrong ancestor?
Good question. I actually like answering this question because that is a very good point. So,
Okay.
as I mentioned at the end, ancestors are those elevated ones who live the life worthy of veneration. Those are the ancestors who, when we're talking about ancestors, that's really who we're talking about, those kind of esteemed ancestors. So if you want to make a prayer to an ancestor, you can call upon your elevated ancestors, however you wish to address them, those who were good people. That's if you generally don't know their names. It could be a case of, parent, grandparent, so forth. They were someone that you respected their energy in life. They could also be someone you call upon. But I would always recommend calling on those elevated ancestors if you're looking for guidance to go through your life. Now, people always ask me as well, what about those ancestors or those who have passed who are not necessarily good people? Which is a very, very good question. So going back to this conversation that I mentioned earlier, is our ancestors are us. All of them, warts and all. So one of the teachings that we have definitely come across with our
Okay.
research is that even if an ancestor wasn't a good person in the physical, it doesn't mean that they should be discarded. It doesn't also mean that they're going to be the ones that you may have on your altar at home, but they are supposed to be given love and upliftment, and we're supposed to help heal them. And the reason for that is they are us. So if we start to discard ancestors because they weren't good people, we're ultimately discarding ourselves. So by giving them love, by trying to elevate them, these are ways that we now start to nourish that energy. So it's about balancing ourselves as a totality. So as I mentioned, they're not necessarily the ones you're going to be putting on your altar and la 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 la. But I don't know why I felt the need to add that. But it's understanding that they're us, and there's probably some ancestors who weren't good people, but unless we address those things, those traits that they exhibited in life may start to manifest within us, our children, or other people. So it's important that we start to cleanse and purify that energy within them, because we're clearing our own bloodline at the same time.
Yeah, I like that explanation because at the end of the day, this is your unique experience. And, you don't want the wrong person hitching a ride.
I like that. Very good analogy. I like that.
Get back in your experience, like, I'm on. No, you're not on. Thank you so much, Verona, for coming. To all our listeners, I want to thank you all for stopping by. This was our smart sister, Verona Spence-Adofo. She has been an incredible guest with a wealth of knowledge. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant woman. And I think her work is really, really valuable. Thank you, Verona, for coming. And before we head out, I want to let you have the last word. You can share anything we might have left out and then take us out.
Yeah, first of all, Faith, I just want to say thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I loved all the different directions that we went in. I'm just thinking, do I have any closing words? Even on the back of, we were just talking about ancestors, and I was just trying to think, what was it? That's already gone. I don't know. All right, so this might even open up a whole new can of worms, but I feel like I'm just going to say it as well. This is just more information.
Yeah.
So another thing you spoke about, you don't want ancestors hitching a ride. And that's a very good point as well. And the reason why I just want to bring this in is that also ties in a lot about the importance of funeral rites. And a lot of us, we don't necessarily see the value of why we have certain traditions that we do. So there's this whole concept of like, we really honor celebrating births and marriage and death and all of these different poignant points in life. But when we look at the whole concept of death, if somebody particularly has been killed or dies in a way that's quite tragic, it's important, and for anyone anyway, it's important that funeral rites are carried out and the energy is successfully transitioned. And the reason why there's all these ceremonies and it's so important to kind of honor death and carry out these ritual practices properly is because if it's not done, those spirits can stay around on this physical plane and cause problems for the living.
Oh,
So a lot of, from my personal opinion, a lot of the kind of negativity that we hear around African sacred science is because there's a lot of this. And then we look at things like the Middle Passage and what happens there. And we have all these traumatic deaths and all these bodies that weren't buried properly, not given those correct rites. Then there's going to be a lot of traumatized spirits going around causing collective problems for us all. So the reason why you mentioned before about the significance of African sacred science is that our ancestors laid out an amazing blueprint for us to deal with different situations that we will face in life. As I mentioned, there's rites of passage programs. We can see in society today, a lot of young people are growing up in a world where they don't feel like they know their place in the world because they can see this dysfunctional, but they don't know what to do. And that can manifest as negative behavior. And that's why these rites of passage programs were put in place to address these things, to remind them of their purpose and why they're here. We have rites of passage, we have the rites that are performed at death, so we can avoid situations where spirits are roaming around, causing problems for the living. We have practices put in place, as we mentioned before, at the beginning of life to let the parents of that child know who that child is so the right things can be done later in life. So everything is secular. We understand that even though you may pass, you'll transcend, come back as an ancestor. So everything is secular. The blueprint has been written out for us, but it's through us practicing and incorporating these elements into our lives that we can start bringing more balance into our physical realities as well, and creating more harmonious societies.
wow, you are so right. And it makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking of the Congo right now and the genocide and
Oh,
what that means.
yeah, yeah. So,
You're
oh,
actually talking about things like this. So we already know the future repercussions
yeah,
of what is happening now if
yeah,
it's not dealt with or addressed
yeah,
properly.
yeah. So these are things that we really kind of need to understand, that our ancestors weren't doing things for the sake of it. They knew that there's spiritual consequences for things that are not done. And so it's important that we do start to uphold these teachings and the practices so we can start to regulate our societies again.
Damn, Verona, thank you so much. You have been such an awesome guest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We hope you'll definitely come back. You ended at such a high note. You're right. That was a huge box that you have opened because it took me to the Rwanda genocide. I thought about that. I thought about King Leopold and the Congo, what
Yes.
happened. I thought about all these things and I was just like, that's a whole conversation on its own. It's a whole,
Mm,
discussion on its own, the repercussions. But thank you so much for
you're
coming today.
welcome. So I'm sorry to end it on such a note that opens up, but then I guess that's a nice segue for part two. But yeah, I just thought that came to me and I thought, it's really important that I actually leave that message here today.
That is so important. And everyone listening, your countries, if that has happened in your region or your country, wherever you are, it's the same repercussions, just so you know. It's really powerful. Yeah. So the more knowledge is power.
So
So
true.
once again, thank you so much, Verona, for joining us. And to all our listeners, remember Verona's info is in the description. So remember to take a look and, have a browse, and whatever piques your interest, go for it. So until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.